Hello chess friends and welcome to Yazato's chess channel and welcome to the TCECC's 19 Premier Division. So after many rounds, Stockfish is still in the lead and Leela C0 had the opportunity with the direct win against Stockfish to equalize the result. Many great games that Leela C0 and Stockfish played so far in the TCECC's 19 ended in a draw, so it was now a time really for a win. We don't want to have, of course, many draws in this finals that will be played after the Premier Division. We'll have the super final and probably Leela, as I mentioned, and Stockfish will play in the finals. So we don't want that kind of a final. We need winning games. We need brutal attacks, and this was such a game between Stockfish and Leela C0. Be prepared. This is again simply beautiful chess, and without further crapping, let's just start the game with our usual sounds. Round one and fight. So e4 played by Stockfish. Stockfish played here with the white pieces. c5 by Leela. Knight to f3. Knight to c6. d4. C takes d4, knight to d4, g6, and now c4. So we have now the Maroczy bind played here by white. One of the main strategical ideas of white is to get this very nice central control. First of all, we have this very powerful 2 pawns in the center, and also this knight, which is also very well placed on d4. So what black in some occasions could do is play knight to d4, queen to d4, of course first bishop to g7, but in some occasions there is maybe the idea knight to d4, queen to d4, and even if you manage to get this through, you don't want to invite your opponent's queen somehow into the game. So one of the main tactical and really this tense moments in this types of variation is simply keeping the position, keeping the tension in the center, so not touching, don't trade off pieces. Even white could go knight to c6, but that's just exceptional, not as a main plan. So we should really avoid so far trades of pieces in the center. So from white's and from black's perspective. So bishop to e3, you see the whole game is so far built around this square d4. We have knight to f6, knight to c6, knight to c3. So far the main theory. Queen to a5, we have knight to b3, and here queen to d8. So till this particular moment, the game was prearranged. Now it was time for the engines to calculate this position for themselves. So bishop to e2, played by Stockfish. The main move, it is really a natural idea because in some occasions you could face the problems of a potential knight to g4 moves where you should then after that retreat with your dark bishop, as you don't want to lose that very important bishop in an early stage of the game. So it's a positional battle so far, this Maroczy bind. The main disadvantage of white in this types of position is always the bad bishop on e2. It is of course so far very well placed and very well directed to the king side, but it is a little bit blocked out by its own pawn on c4. And here after the move d6, the main strength I think that black has here in this type of position is the pawn central control. So it means black has 2 pawns in the center, white has only 1 pawn in the center. So one also of the cracking ideas from black's perspective could be a slow build up with e6 and then with the d5 pawn breakthrough. But it has to be prepared. You cannot just rush into in these types of positions. You have to prepare this move even with some maybe rook to d8 ideas and then finally break the position with d5. Another strategical idea is to play a very powerful knight to c5 outpost with an a5 blockade system. I've explained that in one of my series of the Dragon Sicilian Defense series from black's perspective. You can also check it out, how to play against the Maroczy bind. So it could be also an idea. So if you want to know more about that, check out my Dragon Sicilian Defense series. So okay, here castling played by Stockfish, castling also by Leela C0. We have h3. So this move h3 is a preparing idea. We want, of course, play the move queen to d2, connect our rooks. This would be then our finished development so far. There are 3 stages of the development so far. Then after the potential queen to d2, Stockfish would finish all of the very important stages. So they are of course developing the minor pieces, securing the king with castling, and then removing the queen from the first rank, maybe to the second, third rank, and then simply get this very powerful rook connection. So that's a preparation, because after a potential queen to d2, again this knight to g4 idea could come. Then maybe bishop takes g4, bishop to g4, and black has, I think, a comfortable game because black is continuing the game with the bishop pair. So there is also this line with move f3, but after the move h3, it's really like this, that Stockfish is announcing that Stockfish is trying, maybe, as I said, maybe here kingside attack, because we would have an expansion on the king side with a potential f4 move. So it's also a strategical and tactical idea here from White's perspective to get something f4, g4, f5 if the position allows it. So it's really time to break the position on the king side. So b6 here, Leela c0 plays the double fianchetto style, queen to d2 and bishop to b6. Now rook to d1. The idea is again a prophylactic idea. As I said, one of the main strategical ideas of Black's is e6 d5. In the game, rook to c8 was played, and now bishop to h6. This move really surprised me a little bit, I have to admit it, because you will see this potential trades of bishops and attacking the fianchetto bishop with the move bishop to h6, but that most of the times happens when your opponent, for instance, when White has castled here on the queen side, and then he's trying to attack Black's king after castle with some g4, f4, f5 ideas, getting use of this rook. This rook would be, of course, still on the h file, then trading off the dark square bishop, play something like queen to h6 and deliver checkmate on the h file. So it surprised me a little bit because it's a more simplified line for Black, because Black of course has the very powerful dark square bishop, but it's not a problem if you lose that immediately now when the kings are on the same side. So as I said, here Black's bishop is perfectly fine. On the other hand, White's bishop is a little bit blocked out by its own pawn, so here it's not a problem to go into this line. So knight to e5, we have bishop takes g7, king to g7, and now queen to d4. So Stockfish is playing also, of course, some discovered attacks on the king. There are now some tactical threats with f4, then maybe with e5, pawn breakthroughs, g4, g5. It's really a tough battle already. Now Leela c0 played really an interesting idea, g5. Because, as we said, the main weakness in White's position is the light square bishop. So that's why Black builds here a very powerful blockade on dark squares. And here Leela c0 is trying knight to g6 and knight to f4, cementing this knight on a very, very active square. And this bishop would be really endangered here on e2. Still, we have an attack on this weak c4 pawn also. So this g5 also prevents this very important move by White. White would love, of course, as I said, to play the move f4 and kick away the knight on e5 and then really make something happen. g5, really, really a surprise for me. So this line has never been played in chess history. So it's really a theoretical novelty so far by both sides. Great game, for great positional game so far. Knight to d2. And here we have rook to g8. Very, very brave idea by Leela c0. What Leela c0's idea is to hide with their king here on the square f8. So as I said, from Black's perspective, let's flip the board here a little bit. We have really the powerful pawn central control. We could maybe make something happen with the potential d5 move, but the main goal now would be e6, something like queen to e7, and then rook to d8, simply protecting our d6 pawn and simply have a compact position. Then after they play something like knight to g6 and then knight to f4. So it's a tough plan because Stockfish plays here now a great counterattack in the game. Knight to d5, challenging immediately Black's king and also the knight on f6. We have bishop takes the d5, we have e takes d5, and although White is continuing the game now with this light square bishop, still this bishop is a little bit blocked out, and what Leela c0 is hoping for here, that combined after potential king to f8 combined with the potential g4 move, queen to d7, then the queen could sneak in. These knights are controlling this g4 square very well, and now also creating some checkmate threats on the g file. But Stockfish wouldn't be Stockfish if Stockfish wouldn't find here a great counterattack. So again, after the move queen to d7, we have rook to e1. This is a natural move because when you sometimes have basically your pieces on good squares, so far this bishop at least has some kind of an activity here. Okay, you could play something like knight to e4 and then knight to f3, but it forces a further trades of knights. Then again, we're continuing the game with a good knight by Black and also with a bad bishop on e2 a little bit by White. So that's why Stockfish didn't play knight to f3 or knight to e4 in order to trade off more pieces. Stockfish played simply with the principle of the last piece that hasn't played so far. So that's why rook to e1, simply getting use of the e file. Now if something is opened here, then also the clear target could be the weak pawn on e7. The problem so far is that you cannot improve this backward pawn here on e7. If you play e6 after potential d takes e6, then you would leave also the d6 a little bit isolated, so also weak pawn. So it's really hard so far for black here to push pawns. So king to f8, we have knight to f1. The idea is also to maneuver the knight maybe here on f5 or on h5, also on some very active squares. Queen to f5 and now b3, simply fixing the pawn structure on the queen side. And now queen to f4. If you take here queen to f4, g takes f4, I think black has here really a comfortable game with a potential f3 move, knight to h5, knight to g3 followed with similar ideas. Really, this knight will find a way into the game, knight to e4. So it's really a bad continuation here for white. So that's why Stockfish decides to retreat with the queen, queen to b2, and now g4. So you see, Leela c0 makes progress here. It seems like a dangerous attack already against Stockfish, but now first rook to d4 and now queen to g5. We have h takes g4, we have knight to g4 and now queen to d2. Now Stockfish wants to trade off the queens because the queen has reached really dangerous path here, and now there are also some tactical threats maybe on the h file. Still, black doesn't have to of course to trade off the queens here. Black simply continued with move h5, and this wasn't probably the best of move. Maybe queen to h5 is also here an idea, staying with our queen. If something like bishop to g4 happens, then knight to g4, and at least this knight is a little bit stuck here on f1 because we can never move the knight. This knight has a very nice activity. We could support it even with the move f5, but still you have to do something about your weak e7 pawn. So okay, in the game, h5 was played, and now Stockfish simply trades off the queens because now Stockfish really searched for a simplified line. The queen was really dangerous here on the square g5. Rook takes g5 and now f3, kicking away the knight, knight to h6, and now bishop to d3. Stockfish simply improves the position of his minor pieces. You see, these knights are a little bit out of game. This knight on h6 is cornered, so here Leela tried again a risky choice. It was the move b5. Okay, still this is of course a pawn chain, and the best way to break pawn chains are to break them in the center of the pawn chain. So it would be b5 or maybe something like a4. And Stockfish plays simple counterattack. Again, Stockfish doesn't react. A great counterattack move. We have rook to g8 and now c takes b5. Here, rook to c5, attacking now two weaknesses, the weak pawn on d5 and also the weak pawn on b5. Here we have rook to e3 and now knight to g4. I think Stockfish suggests here, in my Stockfish analysis, that knight takes d5 is probably better than the move that Leela c0 has played. Leela played knight to g4, because after the move knight takes d5, okay, rook to f3 is here the best way to proceed for white, and now we could play e5 again, creating a further blockade on dark squares. As for potential f takes e5, f takes d5, and now you see this knight could come here on a very active square on f4. If something like rook to c4 happens, then we can simply trade. Rook takes c4, b takes c4, and now knight to f4 seems to me like a logical continuation here for black, with potential f6 moves further cementing the position, and still this knight will find a way into the game. Although white has here maybe a 3 versus 1 situation on the queen side, but still I think this knight could handle the position. Still, you have also some worries about your g2 pawn. As I said, I think this could be a playable continuation here for black, but here Leela c0 played knight to g4, and now Stockfish plays simply on a weak pawn on h5. So it was a risky choice, as I said a couple of minutes ago, this move h5. I'm not sure why Leela c0 played that move. Now you see this pawn is a clear weakness, it's a clear target of white. Rook to h8, we have rook to f3, king to g7, and now bishop to c4. Here, rook to c8, knight to d3, knight to h6, trying to remaneuver the knight again on a better square on f5, rook to h3, and now e6. Okay, Stockfish again accepts the challenge, d takes e6. It's not that in this game Stockfish played, I think, something special. It simply seemed to me that Leela beat itself a little bit with this tiny little inaccuracies. After the move d takes e6, we have knight to f5. Okay, you have an attack on the rook, but now after rook to d1, we have d5, and now bishop to d3. This game will now really reach the endgame stage, and I'm not sure what black did see here in the continuation, because after f takes e6, we have b4, first attacking the rook, we have rook to c7, and now bishop to f5, e takes f5, and let's stop now for a little bit, because it seems to me that really something went wrong here for Leela C0, although here there are double pawns, but still it's much more easier here for Leela for Stockfish to create some kind of a good pass pawn. On the other hand, this knight is a little bit stuck to the defense of both of these bishops. This is also a clear target, the weak pawn on f5. Now it's simply time to improve the position of our knight and get here maybe 2 connected pass pawns. So one of the main strategical ideas of a potential endgame is to create 2 connected pass pawns. That's really the main goal here of white, and it could be done because, as I said, white has this 3 versus 1 situation on the queen side, so it's really time to break through. So rook to a3, attacking also this weak a7 pawn. So there are really too many pawn islands, 1, 2, 3, 4, really clear targets of white. Rook to f7 and now knight to e3. We have knight to g4 and now rook to d3. Knight takes, rook takes e3 and now rook to c4, but now a3. First cementing our pawn. We want to keep our advantage on the queen side. Rook takes f4 and now rook to e5, rook to f6 and now simply grabbing this other pawn. Black has of course also 2 versus 1 situation, but still you'll need many moves in order to create at least 1 pass pawn here. So in the potential, in this potential evaluation that Stockfish is showing us here, it says that white is simply winning here. So rook to c7, we have rook to c5, another great move, simply not allowing this rook to come into the game somehow. Rook to f1, forcing another trade of rooks, and now after rook to d7, rook to c4, king to g5, and now simply pushing our pawn. So h4, we have king to e2, we have king to f2, rook to d7, and now king to f3, rook to d3, king to e2, and now rook to g3, and again simply protecting. Now this rook doesn't have any more checks, so it's a +1 tempo now for Stockfish. Rook to d3 and now simply going after this pawn, rook to d4, and now after rook takes a7, basically this game is over because, as I said, we have 2 connected pass pawns. Rook takes b4, king to f3, a couple of checks, rook to e2, f4. Again, this rook goes behind. This is a very important Tarash rule, which says we should go simply behind our enemy's pawns where we could really attack it. Now this rook is far away also from the king, so the king couldn't reach the rook after potential check. So it could be used again with another check, so you cannot attack the rook after potential check on the h files, or pardon me, on the 8th rank. So king to g4, you see rook to g8, never allow this king to come into the game. Again, rook to b8, king to e4, and now simply pushing further, king to b2, rook to b2, king to e1. We have king to e3, also threatening now some checkmate, so that's why first the check, deflecting the queen, king a little bit, king to d4, and now simply pushing our pawn further. f3, we have g takes f3, now h3, rook to h8, then in the game h2 was played, and now b7 after king to e3 in this position. Leela C0 resigned because let's see now the possible continuation. Try to win this endgame, as we always like to say. So test your might. What's now the best continuation here for white? Okay, the obvious continuation that wins really for white is the move king to d1. It's simple as that. You could maybe try rook takes b7, but the problem now for black is here rook takes h2 will happen, and still you have to grab this pawn after potential rook to a7. We have rook to a2, king takes f3, and now you see this rook will cut off. That's this endgame technique, this great endgame technique that Stockfish has prepared here. So you could maybe try king to e3, but now king to c2, and now this king doesn't have any moves. It cannot support this rook from a potential promotion. Now the path is clear here for Stockfish. Stockfish will simply get the king here to b6 and support it with the rook. It will be a promotion end where black will have to give up the rook for a pawn, and of course then after that it's a winning game here for white. So great game again by Stockfish, really almost a perfection. You see it's really a different style now of Stockfish. Stockfish played really this brutal force attacks. Now it seems to me Stockfish is feeling very well in also these positional battles. We see like this against Leela C0. Stockfish didn't rush into any attacks, played simply this common moves, this common improvements of the position of minor pieces, king security, pawn structure elements, and this really great positional elements of the chess game. So that's why I really love this Stockfish and NUE. It's really Stockfish combined with Leela C0 a little bit. They are really evolved, but the Stockfish engine and NUE is really unbeatable. Although after a couple of rounds it lost one game, but it doesn't matter because when you get in some kind of a bad opening, that you can lose, of course, chess games. But I'm not sure who is going to beat now the Stockfish and NUE, because in the potential super final against Stockfish and Leela C0, in my opinion, Stockfish will crush Leela C0. So, okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. I really enjoyed it a lot. It was something different here played by Stockfish. If you want to see more positional, brutal, and tactical games, check out my commented chess games played by computers. And if you want to see the best chess games played by humans, check out my best chess games of all time series. And if you like this content, you can also subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.